Hi there, I'm Jen. This is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of my recent reading. I finished my group for the Booktube Prize, which threw me off because there is one book in there I'm reading for one of the translated fiction groups, and there is a translation choice that one of the translators made that just was shocking, and that's thrown off some of the stuff that I would have been reading otherwise. So, yeah. So that's made things weird. Anyway, let's get on with this. So last night I read the most recent volume of Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips's Reckless, which is a series of graphic novels that are kind of pulp crime noir, but with a 70s and 80s setting. This most recent one is set in 1989, and we normally in this series we're following this one private investigator and then his secretary/assistant. In this one, he is out of town and we're following the assistant as she investigates what may be a haunted house story, may just be a missing ghost story, may just old Hollywood drama. And I think with any of Brubaker and Phillips' crime comics, you know what you're going to get. It's going to be a solid read regardless. I think they can probably churn these out in their sleep. And that was kind of a complaint that I'd had with the last couple of volumes of this, but this one I enjoyed quite a lot. I think in part because they changed the character, it changes a little bit of the perspective, so it feels a little less like they're churning it out in their sleep. Although, again, that sounds negative, but they are so good at this kind of book that it kind of doesn't matter. But I thought this was a real return to form, and I was entertained. Apparently another one is going to be coming out in the fall. So I'll be curious to see how, because as I said, this series started in the 70s and the most recent one is 1989. So it's really interesting to watch the time change and the styles and everything that goes on in the background of these. That's almost as fun as watching the crimes be solved. So yeah, good stuff. I was pleased with that. While I'm on the topic of genre comics, I also read Gébé's Letters to Survivors. This is a piece of dystopian science fiction, which has a very black and white line art kind of style, in which we follow a family that is living in a kind of post-nuclear apocalypse in a fallout shelter, and postmen in hazmat suits come and read them the mail, which may or may not be propaganda stories. And this was originally written in 1981 and was recently translated, I think by Edward Gauvin, who's one of my favorite translators for this kind of thing. It is very dated because it is very an early 1980s portrait of what people imagined a post-nuclear apocalypse would look like. It is also very French in both the stories and the politics that seems to be lurking behind the stories. It is the kind of book where I do sometimes wonder, did this need to be translated? Because I don't think this was super popular. This was a book that I got discounted from a comic book shop that I was trying to get to the high shipping point, and it was reduced to something like $5, which is how I ended up with it. So I think it's interesting as a portrait of that, and I think if you are into checking out how people saw potential futures in the early 1980s, I think this is well worth it. If you were interested in seeing kind of these very French cultural pieces in the English translation, I think it might be worth picking up. But yeah, I think as a story on its own, I don't know how it functions without the kind of external cultural stuff that's going on in the background, but I was entertained with it for what it was in terms of, and how styles of science fiction have changed over time with the changing politics. It is the kind of book that couldn't have been written after the Cold War ended, basically, or wouldn't have been written after the Cold War ended. So, yeah, we're gonna change. I'm clearly not doing my least to most depressing this time, because the next up I'm gonna talk about a piece of children's fiction and children's sports fiction. I don't read a lot of kidlit. If it's not war stories, it's sports stories. So this is Zayd Saleem Chasing the Dream, which is a bind-up of 3 books that were published separately originally. This is by Hena, who wrote Amina's Voice, which a lot of people on Booktube read. That is more solidly a middle grade book. This is a book that I think is written at a middle grade interest level, but at an early reader reading level. So I think it's a fantastic one for if you have young kids who are quite sports mad and are reading independently already. I think this is a book that they could pick up. And it's funny, because it is at this early reader level, you know, it has the huge print and it has the illustrations, but I think in this bigger format, I think middle grade kids would not be embarrassed to pick it up, because that seems to be a thing especially with, if you're familiar with the American Girls series, it made me think of that a little bit, in that those books were originally published similarly to this, short illustrated books, and now they are these bigger volumes, with the idea that I think slightly older kids who are definitely in the interest level for them, but might be embarrassed to be reading a skinny illustrated book, would still pick this up. In this, we follow the title character. In the first story, his parents are making him play the violin, but he wants to play basketball. And I would say that there's a very natural way that that plays out, and I think that that's something that this author does really well, in that she deals with conflict in a way that is going to be satisfying for both the child reader and for parents or guardians, teachers, etc., who may be reading this along with their kids, which I think can be challenging to do, because often the kids solve the problems kind of story becomes a little eye-rolling for older children or parents. But if it's written for the older audience, then I don't feel, then that kind of thing is not really genuinely for the kids who might be reading this on their own. But I think this hits almost exactly the perfect balance. The second story involved making sure that his uncle's future fiancée and he get together, which is the kind of story that, again, often I think doesn't work because the kids will be involved in something they wouldn't normally be involved in. But in these books, the family is quite traditional, so the uncle and his future fiancée are being set up by their families, and so on this date, their entire families are there, so it makes sense that the kid is involved in this situation, which in a lot of books there is a similar storyline, and you have to have the kid conveniently showing up at the date, which never is satisfying for older audiences, for, again, the parent or older kid who's reading this with the younger kid. But in this book, it makes sense. So yeah, fantastic job of this. I think if you have kids who are around 7 years old and are looking for something to read on their own, and they are big basketball fans, I think this is top notch for that. I think if they're a little older, and it's definitely written at an interest level that could entertain kids, again, into the middle grade years as well. So I think that's really successful if you're looking for something for that age group. All right, we'll talk about something completely different now. Next up, I read Mark Alizart's Dogs. This is a very short philosophy book that is basically a philosophical meandering through the connections between dogs and humans, touching on everything from mythology to religion to genetics and breeding. And this is super short, but and it is probably the most pretentiously written thing I have read in several years. I love a good book of random facts, and I like dogs. So you would think this would be right up my alley, but the level of pretension in this is shocking. Just shocking. This was translated by Robin McKay, and I'm sure she captured the original. It's just, I want to say this is terrible, but if you are really into that kind of masturbatory level of philosophy, and you are a dog person and you like random facts, this might be worth picking up, but oh my goodness, it was awful. Even though I liked some of the facts. Actually, there were some that I kind of disagreed with his perspective on, so maybe you wouldn't even read it for the facts. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, next up, I read another one of the Penguin Great Ideas little books, and this is Dai King's The Most Damned Country in the World. And in case you can't see the title there, that's damned not in the damn it sense, but damned in the hydrodam sense. This is a collection of essays and speeches from the author on the Three Gorges Dam, which she's been campaigning against for almost 40 years. And so she will talk about the cultural damage because there were archaeological digs that were cut short because of the dam. She talks quite a bit about the environmental damage. The issue that I have with this is the issue I've had with some of the other Penguin Great Ideas books, which is that as a collection, I think they could have mixed up the included material, because a lot of this does become incredibly repetitious. And I don't think it needed to be. I think if they'd been spaced out a little more, it would be an interesting portrait of how the activism evolved over time. To a certain extent, a couple of them, one is focused more on the environmental picture, one is focused more on the archaeology, but the later ones are all kind of repeating what's in the earlier ones, and I think this author has plenty of other speeches and essays that could have been included, and I felt like once we got to the halfway point, it was chosen because they were short enough to make this within the page count length for these books, which I think does the reader a disservice. Again, it's hard to judge this kind of thing because they are designed as a taste of an author's work, and it's a sampler almost. And I suppose it's fine for that, but I wish there had been a little more variety to some of the later speeches that were included here. So, good, but not great, I suppose. And finally, a book that I am currently listening to the audio version of, and I'm about 3/4 through, is James Ivory's memoir, Pure Ivory. That is James Ivory of Merchant Ivory fame, the filmmaker and screenwriter. He is in his mid-90s now, and he reads this audiobook himself and has a very dry sense of humor that you can hear through it. It's a lot of very matter-of-fact stuff. It doesn't focus as much, at least insofar as at the point that I've read now, it's not so focused on a lot of the 1980s films, which is what I had been mostly interested in. And he also doesn't really talk about, I think, the thing that is interesting on a interpersonal level, which is that he and Ismail Merchant made all these movies together, worked together for decades, and were also partners in the film industry, but also partners in the spousal sense. And I think on an interpersonal level, you always wonder, how do people who work together and are spouses, how do you work that? How do people work through that? Especially in Hollywood, where people always seem to have very short relationships. And he doesn't really talk about any of that. It's all sort of background, both in terms of their working relationship and their personal relationship, which surprised me a little. But it is kind of interesting. It's maybe too long. I don't know. I mean, he's almost 100 years old. He can tell whatever stories he wants, obviously. There's this whole section where he talks about stories from his ancestors, except he was adopted, so it's not like you're going to at one point find the picture and you look just like them because he was adopted. They're also not necessarily that interesting, although maybe if you're interested in certain parts of US history, they are. There's a huge chunk of this that's talking about his childhood, some of which is kind of interesting if you're wondering about what it was like to be growing up during the 1930s, during the Depression, in a kind of, for people who were lucky enough to remain middle class. And there's some interesting stuff about when he was in high school in the early 40s and what it was like to be gay at that time. There's some interesting stuff when he starts filmmaking about how moving between countries, because he was somebody who made movies in so many different countries, that like when he moved to Italy, when he had just finished university, how that didn't play out the way he expected. There's a section where he's talking about a film that he made in Afghanistan in the 1960s, and that's fascinating because it's that portrait of the time. There's some great stories about Ruth Jebwala, who wrote a lot of the Merchant Ivory movies, and that's all really interesting. So I think if you are a fan of his films, and if you're curious about some of the things that he lived through, it's probably worth listening to. But I do think there is a lot of stuff in here, and I think a lot of it will not be interesting to everyone. So this is definitely a book, if I were reading it rather than listening to it, I think there are some chapters that I would be skimming through because I'm not that invested in like the stories about his ancestors. Who are not his biological ancestors because he was adopted, but whether that matters or not. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sorry that I'm listening to it. It's interesting stuff. Just not the most succinct memoir, but again, he is almost 100 years old. He can do what he wants, right? Yeah, okay, so that's some of the random stuff I've been reading lately. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.